Welcome back to another episode of
Just
a
a
Squirrel
squirrel
looking
for
for a
a
nut,
nut,
trying
to
get out of
this
this rut.
rut. It's those last three syllables that mess us up every time, but we're still plugging away, trying to break that nut open. Oleg, it is good to see you again, and everyone in the audience, it is good to shout out to all of y'all. How you doing?
I am well. I'm assuming that was a question for me.
Totally. And for anyone else who is so inclined to answer, I want to hear from you.
That's
So
awesome.
is it true that there's a little spirit in the house? Someone who might just be popping out of the woodwork? Or is it just you and me?
No, I think there is. I think there is a third squirrel that wanted to join us to find a nut today, and him and I have been connected for hasn't even been that long, just months, and I felt like I've known him for years. He's just very very welcoming squirrel-like personality.
Yep. He fits right in the same tree. Where is he?
He is coming up.
Okay.
There he is.
Squirrel, who are you?
I am Tripp Bodenheimer. You just call me Bodie, but I'm so glad to be here with the two of y'all. I told you before we started recording, we got tornado warnings, and you're like the only two people I'm gonna sit here and drive through weather like that.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. And before we go on any further, I'm going to say a little bit about you. You're calling in from Alabama. Oleg is in from Texas. I'm from New York City, but you are the real South there. And you are a leadership instructor with the U.S. Air Force. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
And you are a podcaster, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It is great to have you here. Thank you for joining us as we look for the nut tonight. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a story. You know, the first time I ever understood grief was when I found out that my mother's mother, Nana, who, by the way, was the one that decided that she would call me Scott. My first name is actually Sean, but my Nana called me Scott, and I love my Nana so much that Scott just sort of stuck. And when I was 5, actually, in the Air Force Base in Vandenberg, California, my mom came out and told me that my Nana had died. She was only 65. She passed away from a terrible disease, called scleroderma. And what was hard about it, at my little 5-year-old self, was this concept that I would never see Nana again. I think it was the finality of that realization that really hit me hard. And I remember feeling overwhelmed with emotion. I couldn't stop crying because it was just incomprehensible to me that I would never ever see anyone again, let alone my Nana. Why do you all think that finality affected this kid that way? Oleg, Bodhi?
I think for me, it's maybe misunderstanding of where death is. And
what do you mean?
Well, thinking that death is the ultimate step, the final phase to it all. I don't know how exactly I interpret it, but I know for me, when I was younger and I would receive similar news of someone's passing or no longer being with us, there's some people I remember not having the same reactions, and I think that the level of connection plays a big role. I've realized something about myself recently, and that is the level of grief intensifies depending on the connection that I have with that person and depending on the love that I have for them. So it wasn't until I was 8 or 9 years old, maybe a little bit younger than that, my grandma passed away. And I'll never forget the moment of having a conversation with her in the bedroom. And she had asked me of whether or not I can go out to another room and bring her a set of pillows. Well, next thing I realized was that on my way back, the door was closed. I remember, just like any other little kid, you don't even knock, you just go straight through the door to see what's on the other side. And I went through the door, and she was sitting at a 90-degree angle on the bed, not breathing, nothing. And that was my first real understanding of what it was like to not miss someone, but lose someone. And it happened, I mean, literally within minutes apart, minutes of me leaving the bedroom to go get the pillows and come back. And then from that point on, some of the other losses that I've encountered within my life, I realized a similar thing. I think that why is it the way that you described? I don't know if there's an ultimate answer, but I think that personally speaking, I don't know how I process loss. I think loss, it makes it that much more real. When I lose someone, I immediately think about my own mortality. And I think about my own time frame, so to speak. So whether that person is 60, 70, or 80, I immediately think about, well, I only got 60 more years, or I only got 50 more years until something like that could happen to me. What's even more, I don't know if devastating is the right word, but more challenging for me is losing someone of the same age.
I was just going to ask you about that.
That's a different story. I had a friend of mine recently, 2 or 3 years ago, passed away from suicide. Took his own life in the town that we were born. And, that's where it really struck a chord within me, as far as, wow, here's a kid who's the same age. And it just puts it in perspective as far as, well, not only how much longer do I have to live, but what could happen within my life that can put me in similar circumstances.
Did you grieve his death?
I did. I did in a different way compared to the way that I still grieve my birth mom's death. I think for me, my birth mom's passing was significantly more challenging to grieve through, and it has been. And the biggest reason why is because, so after being adopted, I was able to take a bunch of pictures within my last months or a year of living at the orphanage. And so I captured many of the memories that I had with friends and family. When I recently looked at my pictures, I only have one picture of my mom. That's it. One picture that I took of her. And so I grieved, and I think the reason why I continue to grieve it is because there's so much more that I want to tell her. There is that final hug that I want to give her. There is that, I want to tell her that, it was not her fault or who she was, but it took me many years to get this understanding. It took me many years to understand that someone who battled alcohol is not always at fault. And that's the thing that I wanted to pass on to her, is just that, like, I understand.
Thank you for sharing that.
I finally understand what it's like. And it's a challenge. I go to that space a lot. Not a lot, but I intentionally go to that space. There's a specific song I listen to make myself cry, because I realize that I don't cry. And I think part of it's just maybe the nature of my work and how I'm supposed to be. Anyone that's in a form of leadership, like, crying is the last thing you, quote unquote, should be doing. So after a while, I just realized that those perspectives from other people did become my reality. Like, I forgot how to cry. And then now I have to consciously it's a conscious decision that I make now to cry, at least like once a month. And so grieving has helped me tremendously, because it creates the space for those emotions. But I think in a way it also keeps her alive. Yeah.
How so?
Well, it makes me, it doesn't make me forget her. I think far there's this question I was asked one time, and that is, do you worry about being forgotten?
Mm-hmm.
I think about my grandpa. I think about my late uncle that passed away last year. And I will say that in having observed just those two things alone, to a degree, their presence has already been forgotten.
What do you mean by that?
I think that if there aren't opportunities to talk about their life and the impact that they've had on you, why ever bring them up? And because they're not here, it's not like I can pick up the phone and call either one and share those moments with them. It's easy to keep going. Bodie and I were just having this conversation about, United States culture. This is once again my opinion of it, just like everything else that I've said. For me, it's been a challenge to live in the United States in the recent years. And part of the reason is because of the constant go, go, go culture. I think with the constant go, 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 there's very little time to reflect and think about the people in detail. Like, what are the impact they've really had in your life? Here's a person that you thought was the closest thing to you, but what do they leave you with? For me, that's a personal challenge of living in the United States. In many parts of the United States is the constant move forward. You got a problem, get over it. It's a never-ending journey. I think, Bodie, you have a similar perspective when you and I were talking about it.
Yeah, and with my story, because I can relate to what y'all are saying in different circumstances. Obviously, I was young when I lost my father. I was 11 years old, and I think the shock hit me more than anything else. And there was that instant denial. I can remember leaving the living room, and my father grabbed me by the arm and he was like, "Hey, if anything ever happens to me, just know that I love you and take care of the girls." And I said, "Okay, gotcha." Walked upstairs. About 20 minutes later, he had a heart attack right in front of me. And it was really hard. It was really, really hard to see it. And I remember going back to, my mom kind of like herded us back to the bedroom as the EMTs were coming in. I remember sitting there and I was automatically in that denial. I was like, no, this is not right. We were just talking 20 minutes ago. We were just, a day ago watching sports together. We were doing something. And then the same thing happened, fast forward a couple of years later, my sister passed away. And y'all were talking about age. I was 16, she was 14. And so she was younger than me. And it really, that one was a lot tougher for me to cope with, because it was, both of them were sudden, and both of them, just like you said, Oleg, I didn't get that sense of closure. I didn't get one last hug. I didn't get that, all right, this is the last time I'm going to see you. And, whether it's relationships, whether it's money, we suffer grief at different times in our life. And I think when it comes to those relationships like that of losing someone, I think those tend to sting a lot more sometimes, because we don't get that closure. We don't get that last word to them. We don't get to leave on our terms or say goodbye to them. And I think that our society is so fast paced. It's, what are we posting? Where are we going? What's going on next? To where I think sometimes we don't take enough time to stop and reflect on what we had with them. And I think by having, platforms like this, I mean, we're celebrating these individuals that we're talking about that we've lost. And I believe in a way that keeps them alive. It keeps their spirit alive. It keeps their name alive by being able to share them. I lost my dad 30 some years ago, and here I am talking about him in 2021. And I think that's important to hang on to those.
Bodie, I have to ask, because I know that anyone who is watching or will watch this down the road will ask this question. And I feel like it would be leaving a dangling thread, just needlessly dangling.
Yeah.
Do you think your father knew that something was about to happen to him?
Yes, I do. Yep. And the older I've gotten, the more I've learned about my father, the more I've learned like his story and stuff. Absolutely do. And as a kid, I just thought it was kind of ironic. I was like, how did he know to grab me at that time and tell me that? And, last words I said with him was, "I love you." And yeah, but like I said, the older I got, the more he had some health issues. And, another thing with grief, if you look at the 5 stages of grief, one of that denial. Well, I was in huge denial, and I was a little angry with myself too, because he had a heart attack, but I had seen him breathing in a paper bag like several times. We didn't get playing ball, or just we'd go ride bikes. I mean, we did all this stuff together, and he would tell me, he's like, "Hey, don't say anything to your mom." And me as 11 years old, and he's my best friend. I'm like, okay, yeah, absolutely, yeah, it's our secret. And then I remember right after it happened, I was instantly like, I should have said something. I should have done something. I saw the signs then, but so I lived with a lot of regret. I lived, a lot of denial. I was angry at myself for the majority of my life. And honestly, it wasn't until recently where I've learned to kind of come to that acceptance stage and kind of accept that, I was 11 years old. He was a grown man. He knew he needed to get the help and chose not to. So, yeah, it's been a constant battle that I've had.
What shifted for you? What became important in your life after his passing?
That's a really good question. After his passing, it obviously became my mom and my sister. But then when my sister passed away, my mom, and then it was a lot of struggle as to, why is this happening? Why am I 16 years old and I've lost my dad and I've lost my sister? And what is the purpose of this? And I was searching for questions. I was searching for answers. I was trying to pinpoint what exactly it was. Still to this day, I don't. But I can look at like my daughter, my youngest daughter, Becton. I can look at her and I'm like, this kind of changed. This put things into perspective for me, because it shows me that I was, I went through all of that to be ready to, raise her as a parent, to be stronger. It's taught me a lot of inner strength. I had to grow up quick. I had to grow up really, really quick.
Both of you have shared stories about grieving upon the passing of someone who you knew at the time well, or at least as well as you might have been able to know someone at that age and stage in your life. I am curious, though, do you think that, and this is one that may take some introspection and some bravery to answer, do you think that you missed the person? Do you think that you grieve or grieved for the person, or what they meant to you, what they symbolized? And there is a purpose to this question, by the way, but I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I'll let Oleg go first on this.
I think for me, I think it's the second. I think what they symbolize to me and the connection that I had with them, because at the end of the day, this is just how I process humans and just connections overall. I think it's just the body, it's just the physical form that the one is in, but it's the thoughts and the actions that you choose to give to this life and to do with this body that you're in. That's the things that make the difference, and that's the things that leave that lasting impression on who I am. So the more that I think about people within the people that I mentioned within my life, that like my birth mom, for example, that I still grieve about, and then my grandpa, my uncle, and my grandma, and some of the other people, it definitely is what they showed beyond their age, beyond who they were. It really is the actions that they took in life. It's I think there's also a interesting component that ties to memory, and that's to what degree or which of the things do you choose to remember about them. for me, the more that I think about that question, the more I'm drawn to the kindness and the honesty and the transparency that they all taught me. Those are all, I think, learned behaviors that I picked up from them. I've also picked up, I'll say one other thing I picked up from my uncle and my grandpa is their love for sweets. I mean, my grandpa, the last 10 years of his life, every time I visited him, the one thing you can always count on is an ice cream bar. Always. And I kid you not, I've actually recently bought some ice cream bars and I realized that I bought the same ones, like unintentionally. The same exact brand. So I think the more that I think about that, it just really makes me think that words do matter and one's actions can really change the trajectory of someone else's life, because I just never know what someone else is paying attention to and being aware of. So if I go into an X, Y, and Z place and I don't choose to hold the door for the next person in line, what is the person behind them picking up and what are they leaving behind? Or when I'm in a store and I choose to raise my voice at the customer service for not meeting my needs in the 15 seconds compared to the 30 seconds that it usually takes, what's the lesson someone else taken from that? And how is it making them feel? And more importantly, how is it changing their own actions moving forward? And I think the people that have passed within my life that I do grieve and have grieved through, they've taught me those things more than anything. Is that your words do matter, your actions do impact someone else's trajectory and influence someone else's life, outside of what they look like in the physical form.
Bodie?
I think with me, the biggest thing I picked up, especially like from my father, was I only had him for 11 years. I only had him for 11 years of my life. And I wasn't quite sure for the longest time what it was that I would remember, especially when it got to the point where I was going to get married, I was going to have kids. And I find myself doing things on a daily basis that he would do. And he would come home, he would play with his kids. And then he would spend time with my mom later in the evening, but he would come home, make sure things were done. He was always doing something, always working. And I find myself doing that a lot now, where I'm just go. And I'll stop interacting with my daughters. He was still kind of a kid at heart. I'm still very much a kid at heart.
So, that you are.
We're just talking about my age earlier, so I needed to do but no, it's just I find myself doing little things like I can't remember. I think it was my wife was mentioning, that I would do like little things with my nose, and I would mention that my dad did that, and I ended up doing it. And I think it was just something I might have picked up as a kid, and it just subconsciously I remember it. But what's crazy too is my sister never met my daughter, Becton. But if you were to look at the two of them, they are almost identical with how they walk, how they act, how they speak, just so many things. They both love music.
Wow.
Love of music. And it is crazy to me whenever I look at Becton and I'm like, this is Myers. This is her. This is exactly how she would act. And I think that helped for me with the grieving process a lot. Yes, I wish that, my dad could have seen me join the military and get married and have kids and do all these, big moments in your life, or just have him to go to for advice when stuff is going on. But I think I picked up so much more from him just in the little bit of time I had, because he was present. He was there with me. He spent time, and I was able to pick up on those things. And I think, Oleg, you bring up a good point. You don't realize how much your actions can rub off on somebody else. I mean, it could be 30 years after the fact.
How much do either of you, and this may be a question for Scott here, so he's not playing the 20 questions here, but how much do either of you believe in the concept that people come into your life for a purpose? So like in the case of what you were just describing about your dad, what if your dad's purpose was to literally lead you into that marriage or into that opportunity, but not be there in the physical form? Because I was thinking about it recently, and I was thinking about my own journey, and in particular, the people that have come into my life, let's say for a day or a week or a month, and then afterwards, like I never hear from them again. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here and blaming myself for like, man, what could I have said differently, or did I do something wrong? So talk about grieving, that's definitely involved within that. But then I started to really shift the perspective and think about it through the lens of, well, what if that person was solely there to just point me to some other conversation? Or what if the connection that Leah Frankel and I had was to solely connect me to Scott Mason?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it really got me thinking, like, what is the purpose? And I'd be curious to hear from the two of you, like, is the purpose based on the meaning that you choose to assign? Or is there something else underneath it all?
I, as you may suspect, do believe that relationships exist for a purpose. The purpose may not be apparent to us at the time the relationship is developing, and it may not be apparent for a long time after the relationship has changed, if that relationship does indeed change over time. And it may not even be 100% apparent to us after that fact, if ever. But that doesn't mean that it was there for a purpose. I'm very much a believer in the providential tapestry. That being said, the example that you're talking about actually brings together two different themes that might seem unrelated, but as you just framed that question, actually may be related. One thing that has happened to me sometimes, and there's a particular person in my life that I'm thinking about this with regards to at this very second. So I'll just use that individual as an example. That is someone who I helped get a job many years ago. He and I met each other through a mutual friend, and we became independently friends on our own. And eventually the person who introduced us as friends went on her way in life, and that person and I retained our friendship for many, many years afterwards. Mm-hmm. And then that person and I, we found ways to continue to stay in touch. But as my career shifted, that person made it pretty clear that they were no longer interested in maintaining a relationship with me. And they didn't do it in a way that was nasty. I've seen them on the street ever since then, and it's a very warm, welcoming thing. And I've heard that my name has come up with that person in the past, and he has said, "Oh, Scott, I need to get together with him." Now, over the course of 4 years, you'd think he could find the time if it was something that he was really that concerned about. But that being said, I grieved that relationship, and a part of me does grieve that relationship. It goes as to the question that I was asking both of you, whether I grieve the person or what that meant to me. Mm-hmm. I think personally that the individual is, in some circumstances, what I miss. But I think that is really limited. It truly is. The person can exist anywhere, anyhow in the whole world if I never meet them and if they never have any impact on me. So truly what I'm grieving is the absence of the ongoing impact of that individual in my life. Or in this case, the ongoing positive vibes that I got from our relationship. Yeah. However, I also feel that there was and is in this case grief for something else that is symbolic, and that is the illusion that I believe I had about the nature of that relationship. The individual and what they may have meant to me were one thing. Related to it, but not entirely the same, is the nature of the relationship that we had and what that meant to me. And so there's dual sorts of grief going on. Even if the person were to come back in my life and I were to not grieve the absence of that person's presence in my life, the relationship as I perceived it is dead forever. And I don't know that that grief would fully end even if the person came back into my life. However, I just want to just throw this one thing out because I need to hear what you're going to have to say about it all, Oleg, and you're going to wrap this in somehow and blow everyone's mind. So let me just have you take the TNT and blow it all the way. And that is seemingly at cross current with that is my belief, not that things should not be personalized. And so I may grieve the death of a relationship. I may grieve the death of some intangible thing that had symbolic meaning to me. But I also understand that in that grieving, I'm personalizing something. And perhaps, as the author of that great book, The Four Agreements, would say, I'm creating a miniature version of hell in my mind by grieving something that I ascribed a personal meaning to that wasn't there.
Do you think the cycle of closure is possible? And what I mean by that is having complete closure with an individual that has passed, or will there always be something more that you could say?
For me personally, I've gotten to that closure stage before, and it's kind of like the two different parts. There are still things that I do want to say. There are things that I would give anything. I've thought about that a lot. I'm like, if I had 10 more minutes with all these individuals that I know in my life, whether it's family or friends that I've lost, I have stuff that I would want to say. But also the closure, it's kind of like you get to a point where you feel like I have closure, but then so many times that's been opened back up again. And I've seen it a lot with my dad, where I've had more questions than I have answers. And I get to the point where there's closure, and then boom, something else. And then I have a whole lot more questions. So for me, I've been to that point several times where if you would have asked me right then and there, yeah, I would say I have it. But then something opens it back up.
Why do you all even think we need closure? Why is that something that we crave? Why is it? Oleg, you've started me down. I can't even utter those two words anymore. I blame you for banishing. I'm grieving my ability to use the word we.
You're welcome.
And I blame you for that. Why is it that some people seek closure?
I think to alleviate pain. Whether it's a relationship you're not in anymore, whether it's something financial, whether it's a family member. I think we all like internally struggle with some sort of pain. I think we look to kind of bury that in a way. And I think that is like a sort of closure for us, is when we can say, I defeated that pain. I've buried it a little bit, but it can always rise back up. But I think that's what we're searching for with that, is to eliminate it.
And I think part of that also goes to something that I've started to explore more of. It's the whole concept of overcoming. Overcoming in the traditional sense, and that's conquering something, defeating, eliminating. I started to look at it differently. I think for me, overcoming is a lot more about just redefining, developing a new relationship, because I used to believe that I can eliminate things like stress, anxiety, depression, grief, hardship. And then I just started to realize that that's not a thing. If anything, I just get from one layer to the other. But I'm definitely with you, Bodhi, on what you just said as far as to alleviate pain. And I think if anything, it probably just relates to many of the day-to-day situations. I mean, really think about it. Instead of, if you're going through a bankruptcy, what is the likelihood that you're going to sit in the moment and really process why you got there and how you got there, compared to the likelihood of you just wanting to get through it as fast as possible so you can move past that pain point? And I think, in my opinion, I think it was a conscious choice that I had to make to help myself understand that I can gain meaning from pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering wasn't this ultimate thing that's there to stop me from whatever the goals or vision for my life that I have. But there was a choice. It was a choice that I had to make in helping myself to understand that, like, it's possible to do that. Before that, I didn't think in that way. I was just trying to get through the painful moment. Lose someone, okay, how do you get over that? How can you create a relationship with someone else who can essentially take that spot in your life, take that space, instead of maintaining that space? I remember someone said this to me. It was either right after my uncle passed, or maybe like 48 hours to 72 hours before he had passed. I was having a conversation with him, and he said, think about losing someone as a nail in a big, like, board. When you lose them, that nail falls out, but the thing that remains is that hole. And that hole is always there. And I remember just thinking about that story and just being mind blown in that moment, because it's so true. When you lose someone, especially like when I lose someone, especially someone that I had deep trust with and a level of authenticity. And what I mean by authenticity is I could say anything on the face of the earth and the person is not going to judge. And in fact, the person might laugh or cry or whatever else with me after saying that. Like, that to me is one of the purest forms of connections.
Yeah.
Period. When you can really share that with someone and the person doesn't follow it up with, what'd you just say? Or like, you may not want to say that, but they really just embrace you for who you are. That for me is one of the quote unquote ultimate things that I strive for. Just that form of human connection. And it can come from anywhere and anyone.
Have you all ever grieved for someone that you never knew? There was a guy I was friends with as a teenager whose mom was a huge Elvis fan. And I heard that when Elvis died, which of course, when I was extraordinarily young, I don't remember any of his songs, but of course I know who that is. When Elvis passed away, I heard his mother really, really grieved. She couldn't go to work for like a week. She was distraught. She cried. You couldn't bother her with some other things that were going on. It was a trauma for her. Have you all ever felt that? And if so, what do you think that is or was about? Bodie.
Someone, really good question.
Yeah, someone that I haven't met.
Mm-hmm.
Or known at all. Like Elvis.
Do you think, well, I guess before going into that, do you think grief comes from connection? Do you have to have a connection with someone in order to grieve?
Mine's always about like been reflecting. I've always reflected a lot. I've had that sense of connection whenever I've grieved. Yeah, that's a tough one because I can't think of anyone that I have grieved or had that grief over that I don't have some sense of connection.
Bodie, who was your favorite performing artist growing up and as a teenager?
It's no longer with us, I'm assuming.
No, who's with us now, actually? If they are.
Or
movie star?
Athletes.
Athletes.
I'm a big Michael Jordan guy. Huge
so how would you feel if you found out that he passed away? Would you grieve?
Yeah, it's probably how people were handling like Kobe. You saw it a lot when Kobe Bryant passed away. You saw it a lot when that happened.
Prince.
That one hit. Yeah. So yeah, I could see how people could feel that way. And it's probably because of, with celebrities and stuff, their actions, whether it's a song, whether it's a game, whether it's a movie, probably ties to some connection to some memory they have at some point in time in their life. They can probably connect it to something else.
Or do you think that we fool ourselves into thinking that we know the celebrity that passed away, maybe?
I think we do. Yeah, especially with social media and everything like it is now, and their lives being out there. Yeah, I think that it's like a character being on a TV series. They're like part of your family. They're in your home every week. So I definitely think that people feel some sort of attachment to them based off their character, or their songs, or what have you.
When E.T. died, did you all cry?
No.
No, I was infant at that time. You said you remember Elvis. So I'm just going to say
I don't remember him. No, yeah. I don't remember him. No recollection at all. I'm saying my friend's mother. All right. Let's be clear, my brother.
We're all really young on here.
How much do you, I'm curious to hear from the two of you, how much do you think the grieving of a public figure determines the impact that they've had on the world? So an example of like Kobe Bryant passing away, and literally every single person I could think of in the world talking about him, compared to drawing blank, but there's got to be people that passed away in this lifetime. Someone else.
Yeah.
You know, like, do you think grieving plays a role in the impact that the person has had in the world?
I would say probably not. And there is an example that came up maybe during one of our recent shows. I'm not sure when this came up, Oleg, but I think you may remember it. And Bodhi, you may laugh about this because you may remember this, maybe not. That is when Princess Diana died. The amount of hysteria and tears, I will never forget, like people piling up flowers 10 feet tall outside of Buckingham Palace, and all the news stopped, and people were in America, which we're not even part of any sort of monarchy. She wasn't our princess. Yeah, and all this sort of stuff. I had a very cynical friend who told me that people were grieving because her death represented the end of a fashion show that they had become accustomed to watching. That was cynical. But there was that. The same week, Mother Teresa died. No one gave a you know what. People were like, Mother who? And then they went back to crying over Princess Diana. But I think it's genuinely hard to argue unless, well, maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong. In terms of overall social impact in the world. Deep social impact, I would say substantive social impact, I would argue, that Princess Diana's impact didn't quite compare with Mother Teresa.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you think that, Mother Teresa really was just some person who was nobody, while Princess Diana really was the most important person since Jesus Christ, I mean, that's a whole other conversation we may have to have a whole episode about, because I want to know the answer.
But then I also wonder, like, what is the, I don't know if it's necessarily the difference, but it is maybe the difference between grieving for one of the people that you mentioned, and then also grieving for someone like Bonnie and Clyde, for example, who went around U.S. robbing banks and like, I don't know if like World War II. I don't even know this part. Scott, you might know this part, but after Hitler was gone, did people grieve? Did people celebrate? Like what? I don't even know.
Yeah, in the
that.
U.S., it is curious to know whether people, I have no idea. I do know that in Germany itself, people killed themselves in grief. And I do know he's not comparable in terms of his stature of evil. Osama bin Laden, when he died, I don't think that there were that many people in the United States that were crying or grieving over that. Yeah. Celebrating. I was at the very, very close to the World Trade Center when it fell down. I was directly traumatized for years afterwards because of his actions. And I knew many people that lost those that day because of his murderous actions. even with those people, I don't know a lot of them that actively celebrated.
Mm-hmm.
It may have given closure. I have no doubt there may have been a few people that secretly celebrated, but I don't know. I personally don't know anyone, and my reaction was not one of celebration. It was more like, thank God, good riddance, but not celebration. Now, his followers around the world perhaps were grieving, or maybe they viewed him as a martyr. And maybe some of this goes as to, by the way, our ambivalence about something that you touched on a little bit earlier, Oleg, which is whether really is to the extent to which we have certainty about life after death. Because to me, there has always been a bit of a conundrum. If we do believe that there is some sort of existence after death, why exactly are we grieving? If it's truly the person that we care about as opposed to what they represented, what they symbolized in our lives. If we don't believe in life after death, then I think that's a different story. We. If an individual or set of individuals does not believe in life after death. But I cannot help but wonder if the persistence of grief, even amongst those who believe in life after death, is not at least some sort of acknowledgement that we'll never have 100% degree of certainty.
I have a hard time conceptualizing that. And here's what I mean by that. So I do believe that I am a speck, so to speak, in the larger scope of what the universe and everything represents. But the life after death one, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it because it's just, to me, it's just a concept that is just so far out there. You know, what does that even mean? Like, is there a possibility for me to be a squirrel afterwards, or is that just a limitation? Is a squirrel, because I've heard so many different perspectives on that, like, you know, everyone being one or part of one, whatever that means, like same frequency. So I am part of one, just like the table is part of one, and the squirrel is also, but understanding what that looks like. I remember I was in 10th or 11th grade in high school, way back in the day. I was doing an assignment where I had to read some stories about Egypt, and in particular how people in Egypt, or I guess way back in the day, processed the life after death and the belief that there is such thing afterwards. But if anything, after reading things like that, I was left with more questions than answers as far as, well, what does that even look like? You know, does life take the same form that we're able to experience now? Or does it depend on a whole other set of elements in order for it to exist? I mean, is it purely thoughts? Is it the squirrel? Is it the table? Therefore, should I be more appreciative of the table and not stack so many things on it? Because it's probably hurting, you know? It's a great question. It's a harder one for me to wrap my mind around.
I'm kind of like you. I just, for me, I think at this point in my life, because I got brought up in a very religious family, and I always had questions. I always did, especially when I started experiencing death at such a young age. And it just made me question a lot of things. I even said it on one of the podcast episodes where I talked about it. I said, you know, I was questioning my beliefs in everything when things kept just getting thrown at me. And that's one of the things we tend to do when we go through that is why me? Why is this happening to me in my life? I know my mom, very spiritual lady. She definitely believes in a higher power, but she suffers so much from grief, from the loss of her daughter and the loss of her husband. And then she actually lost her husband as well after that, my stepfather. She struggles with grief. And I'm like you, Oleg. I'm like, am I going to be a cow one day? Am I going to be a cow? Am I going to go into this other world. I don't know. Is it just going to turn black? I don't know. And
and I was going to say, to what degree does knowing that even play a role in your life? Like, what additional meaning do you get from knowing that?
Yeah, and you hear people say it all the time. They're like, we're going to be connected again. And I mean, I think that helps with the grieving process. I really do. But I honestly don't know. And, there's people out there searching that. They spend their whole lives for searching that. But I do think it helps with the grieving process. I do feel like it helps alleviate the pain. It gives them some sort of acceptance to it. And for that, I say that's great. That definitely helps that person get through it. But for me, that's the same thing. I'm still like trying to search. I've always been curious. I've had, Scott, we talk about it all the time, curious mind. I have a very curious mind when it comes to things like that. And
Yes.
I've just had to figure out my own way of kind of suffering, or not suffering, but coping and accepting and grieving.
Bodie, do you think that in your case, being in the military in particular has changed your thoughts about any of these issues?
It's a really good question.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't think being in the military has. I've experienced a lot of loss from people since I've been in the military, and I kind of coped. I think my age, I think life experience is actually, you could contribute the military into that, but I think that just experience and that maturity and getting older. 20-year-old version of me did not handle any of it as good as when I'm in my 30s. I've handled it so much better. And who knows how I'm going to be when I'm in my 40s and 50s and 60s, still suffering from it and going through, because it's something I don't think will ever fade away. But I think the military, to an extent, because it's given me more experiences. It's that's a good one.
Do you view life differently because of your experience of being in the military and seeing loss and things like that on a more frequent basis?
I think that I would still somewhat, when it comes to that, I would probably still be on the same page that I was prior to joining. I think the military opened my eyes to a lot more things, to a lot more experiences that I've been exposed to. But when it comes to loss, I've had friends of mine, whether it's been suicide, whether it's been an accident. One of my last students that I actually taught in Germany, unfortunately, he lost his life in a car accident. And this was right after I'd moved to the States, and found this out, and it hit me really hard. I was about to actually go into a class and teach when I found out about it. And it was, I mean, there's nothing to prepare you for it. I don't think the military, the military has some phenomenal programs. I will say that they have phenomenal programs for it, but it's not something I've ever sought out. And I'm not saying that as a knock on any of it, because I totally 100% recommend anybody go out and seek like mental health or talk to a chaplain or any of those programs. But it's just, we do hear it a lot. They do preach it a lot. They do push it out to everybody. It's something that's definitely known. But every time I've suffered from it, from some sort of loss, the military definitely gives you the support system. Definitely give you the support system. When I was in Germany, I found out my stepfather passed away. My supervisor could not have handled it any better. He could not have been there for me any more than he was. But
Early on in my relationship with my husband, he came home one day.
He's the one that's cooking in the background?
Yes, he's the one that's cooking in the background. Eventually this pandemic will end and I will be alone in my studio during this time. But until that day, occasionally we're going to have the burst of reality come in. And that includes...
You always pull the curtain back and you're like...
Yeah. And having a quality mic also echoes all of these things. But say la vie. Thank you for pointing that out. Now we don't have to pretend anymore that
Exactly.
nothing's going on. So anyway, one day he came home after a walk around New York City where I live. And he said, and he knows that I love Asian food. And he said, I discovered a restaurant as I was walking around in Midtown Manhattan. It was a whole block long, and it was a buffet restaurant, and it had tons and tons of sushi, and it had all sorts of really nice Thai style sushimi and things like that. It had Korean dishes. It had a little grill there. It had some Japanese style desserts. Maybe we should go sometime. And we did. And that became our place for decades. And we brought all of our friends there. If either of you were to have ever come to New York before the pandemic, it goes without saying, I would have brought you there. We spent anniversaries there, birthdays there. And he and I have been together many years. And holidays. So if you talk about Thanksgiving, Christmases, 2 birthdays a year, plus our friends, plus just random days, we've been feeling like we hadn't been to this restaurant in a while. So we would just go. Many, 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 many times. I recently was walking down that street, and I saw that with the pandemic, this restaurant didn't make it. And even now, as I'm talking to you about it, I get very emotional. It wasn't a human being. I barely knew the wait staff there, although they kind of knew us well enough to to put us in certain places, or they knew I liked Diet Coke and whatever. And they would say hi to us, but we didn't have that sort of level of intimacy as individuals. Yet, knowing that it's gone and may never be back, even now, it just breaks my heart. And I grieve about it. I really do. And I came home that day, and the first thing out of my mouth when I walked through that door was XYZ restaurants gone. It didn't make it. I actually even considered doing a short little Scott Speaks video, which for those of you who might not know, that's a little mini video series that I have 2-minute clips that I put on social media about talking about whatever, about the grief I had and the loss that this restaurant's absence will leave in my heart. What do you think was going through my head? Why on earth would I be grieving for a restaurant? I don't understand myself.
Well, first of all, I think there was quite the buildup to the restaurant itself. I was literally about to say, sign me up. Like, I'm flying out there tomorrow to go to this, because that sounded like quite the experience. But I think what it made me think of as you were sharing that, and I don't want to speak for you, but more so just express what I have felt when certain places have closed. It's the experience. It's the experience that those things created for me. It's the experience around not only being able to enjoy good food or food that you enjoy, but it's the people that are with you. Think about it this way. I think about it in terms of, there are certain places that I take my friends to, and there are certain places that I don't take my friends to. Like, there's many of the fast food places I don't take my friends or parents to. So I think there is a level of meaning that I create with each one of those places that in a way probably showcases who I am. And it illustrates my desires, my deepest passions, and just it is just a good description of me. So a place like that, I could see how there could be some grieving that happens afterwards, because I've had similar situations like that in my life. A restaurant closes, and it's not necessarily I definitely feel it's almost like a shared pain, shared suffering that I'm going through. And yet I don't know their end of the story. I mean, they might have literally had to close because they were on a break-even model, and whatever else happened.
They may have closed because they were so tired of David and me.
There you go. They might have closed because of certain customers that were there on a frequent basis.
with their Diet Cokes.
They got sick of making.
No, but I think it's the experience. I think it's the experience. And that maybe goes to a point of why do you choose to go to restaurants to begin with?
It is the experience, I believe. Bodie.
You see it a lot with, well, first of all, I noted that now I know whenever I get together with Oleg and he takes me to fast food, I know.
Oleg, are we going to go to KFC?
Yeah. I just set a standard for myself.
Yeah.
I got to take a note of this now because it's going to determine my friendship.
I will say this if I could. David and I went on an early vacation before I had any money, and he was in school at the time, and we went to South Beach. We stayed in the house of a friend of ours because that didn't cost any money. The airfare down there was super cheap, and it was my birthday. And he took me to KFC for my birthday because that was all we could afford at the time. And I will tell you this, that was one of the best birthday dinners of my life. I still think about it with joy and love to this day. I can still see him sitting there, and I was eating that honey barbecue chicken. So anyway, I'm not going to knock the fast food if you end up taking me there. At least I won't knock you publicly. Maybe I'll knock you publicly, but I'll feel soft inside about it.
I'll talk about it on the podcast. But it's funny you say that about restaurants, because when you talk about like just physical places, I automatically think of like you see people crying when they demolish a sports stadium.
Yeah,
when Yankee Stadium went down, people were in tears because that's generations of their family who's experienced that. But it just made me, and I'm gonna sound like really snooty by saying this, but down the road from where we lived in Germany, there was this phenomenal Italian restaurant, and but we went there every Friday night, or at least every other Friday night, and that was our spot. We knew the guy that ran the restaurant. It was amazing food. And I'm riding around with my daughter the other night, and we go out to get some Chick-fil-A. You could take me to Chick-fil-A, Oleg. But we go to Chick-fil-A, and we're driving home, and my daughter and I are just sharing these memories we had from Europe. And nothing got her more teary-eyed than when I brought up that little Italian restaurant. And because it closed during COVID. And when we found out that it closed, it was heartbreaking for our family. We were like, that was like one of the last places we ate at. That was where I went for my birthday, just like you were saying, those occasions. And here's my daughter. She's been to all these countries and had all this wonderful stuff happen, but I bring up some Italian restaurant closing, and she's just in tears because of the memories and the connections that she has to it. And the good food. Food was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
How have you all been able to, if you've been able to, turn grief into gratitude?
I was going to use the term gratitude if you were talking about how have I turned it into a positive. I'm thankful. I'm thankful. I know it sounds weird, but I'm glad. I'm thankful I had 11 years with my dad. I'm thankful I had him for those 11. I'm thankful I had 14 with my sister. And, I read something a while back about gratitude. And have y'all seen that about the studies about people that wrote out what they're grateful for? So no. It was
the audience might not have anyway. So
yeah, there you go. Yeah. So it's there was a study, I think it was at Berkeley, and it was one group wrote out what they're grateful for. The other group wrote out like what they miss most about them or something like that. And I think the other one just didn't do anything. And they monitored these people for like a year just to see how each one of them coped and overcame. And the group that wrote out what they were grateful for, not just, journaling, writing down their feelings, but actually what they were grateful for, so many more strides than the other groups. And I think anytime, whether it's a person, place, restaurant, anything that's been put in front of us, we need to be grateful for, because everything has an expiration date. Everything has an end date. We got to be grateful for that time we have with whatever it or they may be. And that's something I've really learned, is to just be grateful. Be grateful for the temporary acquaintances, the long-term acquaintances, and the ones that come and go.
Are you ever grateful for grief itself?
Yeah, because I think we grow from it. I would not be the same person I am today if I had not experienced everything, and the grief and the heartache and the pain and the anger and resentment and all those feelings that I've felt in my life. I totally don't think I would be sitting here talking to, the two of you and to this audience if it wasn't for that. So I do.
Do you think grief is a gift or a privilege or an honor to experience?
I think that it definitely prepares you for things, because I think it's so deep with so many different stages and levels of it that you go through. I think that you see people who've never experienced depression and have never, like they've had things go bad for them, that anger, that, when you're like bargaining, when you're asking questions like, why has this happened to me? I'll never do this again if this happens. That's real stuff. And I think that it's something that I definitely think prepares you, makes you stronger. Once you see, I can overcome this, I've gotten past this, you can use it as a learning lesson for something else in your life, to where you're in a similar situation. You can say, I've dealt with this before. I felt just absolutely worthless like I am at this point, but you know what? I rose up and I overcame it. And you have something to almost like reflect back on.
Nina actually put up a very, I felt, beautiful and poetic response to the question. Nina, thank you for that.
Yep.
Oleg, are you grateful for the grief that you felt at various points in your life?
Absolutely. I'm grateful, I think, for life in general, looking back at it now, because one of the things, and I know that the two of you know this about me, but some of the other people listening may not. For me, life started to shift and take a completely different form when I started to look at it through the lens of lessons and takeaways. So even in the most challenging of circumstances, such as losing someone and grieving through that process and really trying to understand what their life meant for me and the impact that they've had on my life, one of the biggest ways that I've been able to, quote unquote, overcome or work through many of those things is by choosing to pair up that person's existence with the lessons and the takeaways that they've taught me. I don't know how it is for the two of you, but for me, I mean, it's been transformational, like in every sense of that word. And I noticed that even now, whatever the situation may be, whether I don't know, wearing different socks or not wearing socks or can't find my socks, I find myself immediately going to, what's the lesson here? What can I take from this particular event to any other event that's bound to happen? How can I look at life through a different lens? Now, this is a simplified version of at least 8 to 10 year plan that I put myself through, in developing this mindset. But I will tell you that when I started to look at life through that, it was one of my first feelings of really experiencing the concept of life is happening for you and nothing is happening to you or against you, but everything is literally flowing with me, because now I can see the reasons and whether or not those reasons are quote unquote ultimate reasons or even in close proximity for what that reason is, to me they are, because I choose to assign the reason behind each one of the circumstances. So I am grateful for that. And that's why I think, in my opinion, gratitude is so much more than being able to say thank you. It's a feeling. I think if anything else, it's a mindset. And it's a frequency. And if tuned into it like I am, I just realized that my life, it changes completely. I literally don't see things in the same lens anymore as I used to.
Did you grieve the loss of your socks?
I did. There was one pair of basketball socks. I'll even tell you the exact same brand and the exact color. It was Nike Elites. It was white socks with black stripes. I wore that particular pair for 2 years. They lasted 2 years, and that's playing basketball 3 times a week for 2 years straight. That pair of socks lasted that long. And I did grieve afterwards when I had to throw them in the trash because the holes became just, not manageable. Usually I would put up with certain things, like if a hole is like this size, but like once it got to like this size, once it got to the size of the bottom of my foot, that's where I realized that it was really no longer serving my purpose. So I definitely experienced grief, and I think it's because I had such a deep connection with them. I had a deep connection with the purpose that they provided.
There was an interesting series that was on cable television a few years ago that I was obsessed with. And kind of my obsession was kind of based on the fact that they used some really cool computer generated effects to make this scenario that they were portraying in this series look super real. It was about prehistoric life before the era of the dinosaurs, which I had never really appreciated exactly how fascinating that was and how much my obsession with dinosaurs had obscured my ability to learn about some really interesting creatures. And so one of the things that they had these, to explain what the lives of these animals were like and what they looked like, they would create scenarios that these animals might have lived in and encountered based on fossil records that we've seen. And one of the most memorable sequences, so there was some sort of global catastrophic event, and a massive, and I mean massive, number of species died. But there was one species, it was an herbivorous species, that survived. And apparently this one species of animal was something like 70 to 90% of the life on Earth. It was a fairly big size, maybe a cow-sized animal. And because there were so many of them, they just traveled in packs together, presumably to protect themselves against predators, but also they seem to have a pack instinct based on what we know about them. And it showed very vividly the journey of this herd of creatures. And as they were stomping along to wherever they were going to go, they were going through some mountain pass. And the pass that they were going through wasn't really necessarily all that wide. And let's face it, pre-dinosaurian, but not quite reptilian creatures didn't have the biggest brains in the world, and they weren't the best at navigating and hiking, certainly not at our level. And so every now and then they were showing these animals, they would just sort of fall off to their deaths on this mountain path, the sort of cliff edge.
They didn't have the GPS back then?
What'd you say?
They didn't have the GPS back then?
They did not have GPS 400 or 500 million years ago. And the others, as portrayed here, and there's no reason to believe that this was probably not accurate, the other animals in the herd would just look at their compatriots sliding off the cliff to their death, squealing miserably, and then they would just keep on marching. They were encountering loss after loss after loss. They didn't care. They felt enough of a communal bond to desire to be around others of their kind and to travel with them, but they felt no connection. And they certainly felt no grief upon the death of these animals. Why do you think grief became part of our psychological makeup? And by the way, I doubt they felt gratitude for the time that they spent with those other animals that went down the cliff. And I would be curious, maybe, why is gratitude part of our psychological makeup? Bodie?
Yeah, Bodie, you're definitely going first on this one.
That's what you get for going on this show, boy. You'll never we'll make sure you grieve over hanging out with us two.
I was just kidding about the fast food stuff and all the shots I've been taking.
Yeah, some of those animals became fast food, just a different chain store.
When I was listening to your story, Scott, it was automatically sparked something with me, because I was thinking, like, what species, like who does feel grief? Is it just, humans? Is it animals? But I think back to, I remember when my father passed away, our dog would not eat his food.
Wow.
For weeks. Would sit by the door, because my dad fed the dogs every night. And when he had his heart attack, that dog was sitting in his lap. And actually, I'm not to make light of the situation, but when the EMTs came in, the dog attacked the EMTs.
Interesting.
But yeah, he would sit by the door every night and not eat, and was basically like starving himself to death, because my dad wasn't there feeding him. And that's always stuck with me. And I've always, I'm a huge dog person anyways, but I felt like they suffer that grief. They feel that. They feel that loss. And then with the gratitude piece, I really think that gratitude it's almost been like a coping mechanism in a way. Like, it helps us get over it. It helps us be appreciative of what we've had. And because if we suffer, it can be a vicious cycle. So I think that gratitude is what gives us that some sense of closure. You'll never fully have it, but I think that it allows you to kind of move on and just be thankful for what you had with them.
Do you think dogs grieve when you leave, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour?
If you look at mine grieve like crazy whenever I can go out and get mail, and they're going. we have a little puppy right now, and I call her a puppy. She's like 1 year old, but I can't walk outside the house without her just tearing the door down because I'm. So, yeah, she grieves every time.
It's a really interesting question. I was actually just thinking about that. Like, what is actually, Bodhi, that's a really good question. Like, what species is able to experience grief, and what do you need, more importantly, to experience grief? I mean, is it something that only humans are able to experience? And is there a difference between that and missing someone like a dog when I leave? I'm not in the same exact boat as you are. When if I leave, the dog's going to tear the door down. He's 8. He's 8 years old, my dog. And, sometimes he'll get up and kind of walk me out. And I think part of that is just wanting to join, wanted to go on the adventure. Mm-hmm. But then there are other times where he will actually just lay in his bed and not care.
Yeah.
And just like continue sleeping. So I wonder, to what degree do they miss you? And because when you come back, I don't know how it is for you, but when I come back, it's as if he's never seen me.
What do you mean? Like, he doesn't even recognize you? Or
well, he does recognize the joy, the level of joy, and it varies. I could literally be going just to my car and back, which in total, that's a 45-second trip, not even a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same level of gratitude and joy that I see in him compared to being gone for a week.
Wow.
Or a month. So it's interesting to just think about that and how the two maybe are interconnected somehow.
Nina's point actually illuminates this survival mechanism. And she brings into the conversation the notion of tribe. Grief unifies the members of the tribe.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting distinction from the animal situation, however many hundreds of millions of years ago that I was talking about. They were a herd, but I don't think anyone would fairly describe them in any likelihood of it having been this way as a tribe.
So with that said, then, do you think that we as humans are the only ones that are able to experience some of these unique things?
Elephants,
Just
they
like
say, grieve.
pain and suffering and grief and joy to the degree that we're able to?
To the degree, I would bet we don't know. I would say that historically, we probably would have said no animal, even if animals can experience grief, we probably would have said maybe not to the same extent, or maybe not the same way, or maybe not with the same level of reasoning. But elephants in particular have been observed to apparently exhibit signs of extended grief and maybe even some primitive grieving rituals. I was reading an interesting piece about octopi. And the story that I was reading was about the incident I was reading about was an octopus that lived inside an aquarium. And there was a cleaner that had like a squeegee thing that he would stick inside the aquarium to get rid of algae or whatever that was building up on the side of it. And so one day when he stuck his hand in to begin cleaning the side of the aquarium, the octopus grabbed the squeegee out of his hand and began to clean the side of the aquarium itself. Yeah, exactly. And that is the sort of thing that leaves one thinking these animals may have more complex mental processes than we have appreciated. That's some complex thinking. Not even a dog would be thinking at that high of a level. And so you wonder, well, maybe these animals are feeling grief and we don't know it.
If my dog can pick up his dog poop afterwards,
yeah, right. Like that's some serious Einstein doggy mental state. The other thing too that I question with regards to animals is to what extent creatures that may have been human-esque throughout the historical timeline, but were not human, could or would have experienced grief, and when that evolved. For instance, I've read that we have archaeological or fossil evidence that Neanderthals had death rituals, and at least one other extinct species of human-ish beings had burial rituals, which implies that they felt grief and possibly even had the concept of the afterlife, because in some of these, it wasn't Neanderthal, but it was another species that they found graves, and they had in the grave some artifacts that were artificially made that were laid on top of the body of the deceased.
Vikings did that a lot.
Yeah, but this was way like this was way before that, this Ice Age era. And so but then there were other species of pre-humans that may or may not have had that level of complexity, and would they have felt grief even despite that? One thing I don't know is to what extent other primates feel it or not.
That's a really good question. I don't know much about it when it comes to life that was here prior to us, but it's definitely something that makes me think about more, and to what degree have we as humans developed some of these things, and what really made it possible. I mean, what made it possible for one to grieve or recognize what grief looked like, or love or fear. I get curious about even the concept of fear, slightly off topic from what we're talking about now, but to what degree did the humans create meaning around that concept? I mean, there might be an actual component if the tiger is chasing you, being fearful, running for life, but at the same time, do those circumstances apply anymore? The fear of not starting a new career, the fear of not starting a goal, the fear of not having a conversation. is that the same level of fear as being chased around by a lion or a tiger, fearing for your life? So that's where I think kind of goes back to Scott's point, to what degree have we as humans just created additional meanings to subjects that don't actually mean the term to begin with?
You know, Bodie mentioned the Vikings a minute ago. I think that it's interesting that you mentioned them, because what we're also talking about there is a completely different culture. And I find it fascinating that you mentioned, and I hope I didn't imply that you were thinking that these ancient human-ish beings were the same as the Vikings. I wasn't thinking that. One of the things, though, that's interesting as I'm sort of processing what you said is that rituals, in this case, were very similar and crossing species.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point.
Bodie, I know that I would grieve if I found out that your podcast was not on the air anymore. And I know that people who are listening or watching will grieve if they cannot figure out how on earth they can find out more about you and that podcast. So could you tell us more information? Because there have been enough tears flowing today. It needs to stop.
I was getting excited. I thought we were getting into. I just read a book on Vikings not too long ago, so I thought we were going down that path.
I can't wait. We need to talk about that. I had no idea. Okay.
Oleg and I got started talking about Norway and stuff.
I love it. Oh, wait. What Viking god would you be if you could be any god?
That's easy. Thor.
And Oleg, if you can answer that, what'd you say?
Thor. Yeah.
I knew you were going to say. What about you, Oleg?
Same one.
I will say this: a little bit of everything we talked about earlier, kind of, you compile it together, and that does give you how the Vikings grieved. They got rid of items. They in certain places they would bury you. It was like everything just compiled all together at that once. I just thought it was interesting, kind of connecting all that together. But yeah, the podcast, we'll do an episode on Vikings. But yeah, the podcast, as you can see here, the link tree to go find us. It's kind of fitting that I'm on here doing this episode, this topic about grief with the two of you, because the two of you have actually been on the podcast. Scott, your episode comes out Monday.
Can't wait.
Little plug for that one. And it is an amazing episode. I think your story about where you were during 9/11, being in New York City, that was one of the most, I was just enthralled with what you were saying. I was so lost in your story to where when you finished, I was like, yeah, I got to finish this episode. But yeah, the Shadows podcast, it's something that we're still kind of in the infancy stage. We've been around 6 months, but we've had some incredible guests, and our concept is we all have a shadow, and it's that one constant that's with us from cradle to grave. And when you're in your darkest moments, it feels like no one's there. That shadow is still with you. Where you're pinnacle of your career, your personal and professional lives, that shadow seems like it is so large, but it eventually fades away. But it's always there with us. And concept is we have people come on, they share trials, obstacles that have been put in front of them, moments of grief, denial, anger, everything we listed earlier, and ultimately get into that acceptance stage and kind of overcoming everything and sharing their story with an audience. And we've had some remarkable guests. We have a very diverse group. It's not just military personnel that come on there, but we try to shuffle it up and keep it fresh with the people that come on. But we're loving it, loving the connections, loving being able to hear people open up. And it's incredible when someone will listen, we'll record an episode and then somebody will reach out to me and say, man, that episode with Oleg changed me. That's all I needed to hear to get going. And it's to give somebody a sense of motivation. And you may be struggling with something. You may be suffering from something. But you can tune into one of our episodes on the podcast, and someone went through a similar situation to you, and it gives you a sense of hope. And that's kind of what we're looking to do, is to just help people out. Love
it.
Follow us here on the link. We're available on over 10 podcast platforms. Got a Facebook page, Instagram, and just started YouTube page.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Like I said, Monday we got Scott's episode, and Oleg is in our archives. If you can go to any of those podcast platforms, you can hear Oleg's incredible story.
Oleg beat me to the punch. Whoa. I'm grieving.
You can blame we'll blame Joe Bogdan for that. he said I had to get Oleg on before you, so that was his call. But yeah, and actually my story was episode 3, so I mean, we've all three. I was a guest on my own podcast,
and it is an excellent episode, as is everything that you touch. And I have to say, your guest list, excluding me, Oleg and everyone. I mean, look, they are some phenomenal people. Speaking of Oleg, is it true that you have 2 podcasts in addition to this one?
Yeah, I'm going for 4. I mean, why not? You only live once.
4, what kind of number is that? I heard 5 was a little bit more magical. On the subject of Vikings, we'll throw some rune stones around, come up with a number for you. What are these podcasts? Oleg, tell us.
One is called Overcoming Odds, which in a way is a shadow, so to speak, to Bodhi's podcast. And that's very similar topics and very similar stories that we cover. And that's people who have faced adversities or challenges in their lives and are looking for a space to gain insight into the meaning and purpose behind those circumstances. Outside of that, there's another one that I've recently launched called The Power of Your Story, which I'm a huge believer in. I am a huge believer in the concept that everything starts with a narrative. And whatever your narrative is, not just about your whole life, but about any particular instance within your life, that is the narrative that I believe determines the outcome and the trajectory of one's life. So that's what I wanted to do, is I wanted to create that space where people can better understand those stories and ultimately reframe them and look at them differently. So everything that we've experienced now, I think outside of looking at this as a conversation that we've had around the concept of grief, I think in a way we've also experienced grief through this hour and a half, just by being able to share the stories and let those stories transform us. So those are the biggest things that I aim for when it comes to my life. And I think that also ties into your show, Scott, as it relates to the purpose and the meaning behind one's life.
Yes. So, Oleg, you pulled the cat out of the bag. I indeed have a podcast of my own that I do in addition to this one, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway. It is at purposehighway.com. It is creating a space for people to talk about their connection to a higher purpose, to build a better self and a better world. If you like that sort of stories, listening to entrepreneurs and great thinkers share these things, then this is the podcast for you. But before I talk any more about that, there's a couple of other things that I just want to throw out there. First of all, Nina and anyone else who watches, listened, or otherwise engaged with this show, if you enjoyed it, please leave us a review on Facebook, tell other folks about it, and come back again. We cannot, will not, and would not want to miss a single bit of thinking that you'd have about anything that we talk about. As it says in the scroll on the bottom, if you enjoyed the show, consider leaving us a review. Also, I'm going to close out with a pitch for something that both Oleg and I are involved in together. Oleg is the founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Overcoming Odds, which can be found at overcomingodds.today. I am the chairman of the board. We both, well, I won't speak in terms of we. I'm going to speak in terms of personal impact. Overcoming odds by facilitating self-expression about the most meaningful, challenging topics that one can discuss, has helped me find a community that has completely changed how I have viewed the world, how I interact with others, and made me into a stronger, better, more amazing human being. If that is something that appeals to you, Overcoming Odds, like any nonprofit, is always looking for your support. But for more information about it, by all means, find Oleg on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. Overcoming Odds. Look up Overcoming Odds today, and give it every bit of support that you can. Oleg, do you have anything you want to add to that? You are, after all, the founder and the CEO.
Well, first things first, that was probably one of the best testimonials I've ever heard in my life. But outside of that, I will say that for me, what matters at this chapter of my life is being able to create a space where people can shift their own perspectives. And that's one of the biggest things that I think we have been able to accomplish through this work, is bringing a group of people together, the two of you included, and so many others who have been guests, whether it's on podcasts or part of the events, and just openly express who you are and what you've been through and how you feel and what it is that you choose to make out of those experiences. And outside of that, one other thing that I'll put out there for people that are listening is we're hosting an event called Survive to Thrive Attitude of Gratitude, something that we've been doing as of last week. And it's going to be streamed like this through StreamYard. So if you're joining on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, wherever it is, you'll be able to join it. But we'll have another time on Sunday at 11 a.m. Central Time where you'll be able to join us. And I think the topic is actually grief.
Yep.
And in particular, what's the relationship between grief and gratitude? What is it that you actually grieve for? Is it the person? Is it the feeling? Is it the thought? And outside of that, I'll just say that for anyone that has enjoyed this show and enjoys the power of having an open mind and open perspective, it's a great place to be.
I see that Nina responded with one of our earlier requests with "You Bet." Thank you so much, Nina. Bodie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It will be good to see everyone next Thursday. Do not miss Sunday's event in the meantime. Boom!